Focused on returning to the World Cup stage after a 20-year absence, the team departs for Riyadh on December 13th. Internationally, police have found a positive match between the fingerprints of a suspect accused of fatally shooting healthcare insurance CEO Brian Thompson in New York to those discovered at the scene of the crime. If confirmed, it would mark the first forensic link tying 26-year-old Luigi Mangione to the healthcare executive's murder outside a Manhattan hotel a week ago. Mr. Mangione was arrested on Monday in Pennsylvania, where he is being held on gun-related charges as he fights extradition to New York to face murder charges. He's pleading not guilty to those offenses. The lawyer said in relation to the Pennsylvania charges, adding, "I haven't seen any evidence that he is the shooter." U.S. states each have different laws and judicial systems, and the process involved in the transfer of fugitives could take days or weeks. Well, that's news to the hour on WESN. I'm Naomi Magnish. Thanks for watching.
WESN.
Yourself a merry little Christmas. Have yourself a merry.
It's very pretty, Hallie.
Christmas.
Do you want to know the rest of it?
Have yourself a merry little Christmas.
It begins with a little girl.
I bet you want to be a ballerina when you grow up, huh?
What if I'm fat? What if my head's too big? Wait till I'm in 3rd grade. Then I'll pick a career.
A little dream.
Can I use the lap?
Sure.
No, we really gotta talk.
You can't ask Santa Claus for that.
And a little magic. To remind us
Oh, you're back.
I'm back.
This is Santa Claus, not Dear Abby.
that Christmas is something to believe in.
I had to see him. This is special. Not all Mom and Dad should get back together, but ours should.
What is it? What's wrong with her?
She was feeling fine, and all of a sudden,
Is Mommy coming?
wow, you look gorgeous.
Paramount Pictures proudly presents a movie about a family, about a wish, and about the miracles that are inside of every heart.
You know, I usually specialize in stuff you can wrap.
All I Want for Christmas. Share it with your family this holiday season.
WESN.
One of the things that I genuinely believe that blocks a significant amount of attempts to improve just about anything with regards to the governance of this country, the public service of this country, to some extent maybe even how private sector conducts service and customer relations, but significantly less so, and that's a more indirect thing. Accountability. To some extent, there may be some areas in the private sector where that's a concern, but that's a concern for each individual entity in the private sector. If one fast food chain doesn't have accountability in its workforce, then the others will merely take advantage of it. But in the public sector, it seems as though bad practices eventually spread because we see, at least in my opinion, many of the same issues across the board, whether it is an office, a paramilitary arm of service for national security, medical or education. It doesn't necessarily pervade into every corner and is not necessarily practiced by every individual, but we see similar issues. And that suggests, to some extent, it's a combination of two things. One, trickle down from the top, and two, regardless of creed or race, human beings have a tendency, well, to follow along the lines of the saying, monkey see, monkey do. If I see someone get away with something, I will at least consider whether to do it or not. That's rhetorical. I'm not talking about myself. Although to some extent, I'm not immune to that phenomenon either. One would hope you would then rethink and make the right decision. But at the end of the day, the law of averages states some amount of people will not make the right decision. Why do I bring this up? Accountability. An important issue that blocks improved services, that blocks proper delivery of service. Well, the example I have today is with regards to the Registrar General's office in Tobago. Now, the AG has come out. First of all, he has apologized for the issues, even though he is saying that it's not directly the fault of central government in Trinidad. Yes, yes. Although, given what he has said, that doesn't necessarily absolve them of any indirect blame, or rather blame for indirect actions. But first, he's come out to apologize. I appreciate that. Second, he has pointed to the fact that there has been no instruction. One of the key things is, it seems, and I'm not going to say it's limited to this, right? But one of the key things is, apparently people were told, well, no, if you want certain documents to be processed or certain work done, you have to go to Trinidad to get it done, which may have been the case in the past, but at the very least, even if that's so, it's not the case anymore. And the AG said no such instructions for that sort of thing was given. Now, apparently there is a very real situation with software being updated for whatever reason and Tobago not having full access to that. That is being rectified. And I don't know to what extent that impacted this situation. The situation of people being directed away from whoever is in front of them in Tobago and being directed to Trinidad. You can't do it here, you have to go there. Now, what did I say? Issues of accountability seemingly spreads, right? Where does that sound familiar? You can't do it here, you have to do it there. I know. That sounds like the police service. You can't make that report here, you have to make the report there. Now, from what I understand, there is to some extent practical reasons why you, the private citizen, may not want to make the report in the nearest police station. Part of the reason could be if there's a lot of people there and the lines are long, then it's like, well, you might as well just go to the other station to make the report because you might actually get through faster. There might be minor things like that, but generally speaking, you should be able to make a report of a crime in any station. And I have heard of stories where it's not because of there's practical logistic things like you'll end up waiting an hour in line to make the report here, you might as well go somewhere else. But rather the implication is you're going to make the report. You've already reached the person and they're saying, no, you can't make a report here, you gotta go elsewhere. While the leadership of the police service is saying, no, you make a report wherever. Wherever. Just make, and I believe part of that is we want people to, one, make the reports in the first place, and two, make the reports as soon as possible. But despite the leadership saying something to the public and having a policy that I believe has reasonably made its way down to the rank and file, The rank and file in that case seemingly wants to disregard said policy. And a similar situation has happened apparently in the registrar's office in Tobago. Because again, the AG has said there was no policy for the like. Now here comes the part where they may have indirect blame. Because accountability is fine. In the immediate, the accountability is, well, what is the supervisor of the individual who may be going against policy? What are they doing? But then as you go up to the short, medium, and long term, it goes up the line. Because the longer it goes on, the less and less deferral could be made by those further up the chain. The less and less credible are excuses that, well, I didn't know. No, at some point, the people at the top need to spend some time. You're not going to check in on every rank and file at the ground level every day, because to some extent, physically, you can't check every site every day. But you need to have a reasonable time frame where at some point you do get some glimpses of what's going on as low as possible on the rank structure in as reasonable short of a period, or rather with short intervals, reasonably short intervals in between check-ins, so that you will be aware of what's going on the ground. And I say all that to say that at some point, the longer it goes on, and I'm not necessarily sure if the Attorney General and the government is completely at fault for not knowing what's going on in Tobago. But I'll just say on a general principle, this is an example of no, you need to check in or have somebody check in for you who will then give you feedback on what's going on throughout your area of responsibility. Because at the end of the day, the buck stops with the person at the top. If it's a problem that happens once in one day, that's fine. But if it's an ongoing issue, and the AG said there's credibility in some of these complaints, so he can't say that it was people making much to do about nothing. 2 people are apparently being investigated over this. And essentially, this is what's supposed to be done. But the key point is, I don't know if the time frame of the solution is quick enough to be considered reasonable. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, right? But regardless, at least in this case, we are seeing the basic, obvious form of reconciliating this issue. Apparently, allegedly, we have employees not following policy, not doing their work. The low-hanging fruit answer, which is by no means necessarily the truth, but the assumption a lot of people may make, because you may have seen this in other areas, whether public or potentially even private, they're lazy, they don't want to do work, so they try to push somebody work on somebody else. They don't care about inconveniencing the public or the customer. So, of course, now, at some point, if their supervisors can't deal with it, it has to go up the chain until it reaches to, in this case, the Attorney General, who has to see about it. But now the question is, and the reason why I bring it up is, even if the Attorney General is doing everything right here, let's just make that assumption, we don't necessarily see this being done elsewhere. And I think it would be naive for any of us to think that, oh, this only happens here. And maybe with the police who don't want to take reports. And it doesn't happen elsewhere. No. And if it's not this specific example, it's something else. Along the lines of, we need more accountability to prevent rule breaking, to prevent poor job performance that goes beyond a lack of ability, although if there's a lack of ability, one could argue why was such an individual hired in the first place, but poor job performance due to a lack of willingness to, do the job. This is not a unique phenomenon to us. Apparently it happens in Washington, D.C., one of the busiest capitals in the world, because it is a city that conducts not only national business of one of the largest countries in the world and the largest economy in the world, but also international business. UN notwithstanding, in New York, One could imagine the amount of different interests from around the globe that descends on Washington, and yet, they have concerns about public servants not showing up to work. So who is we? And this is one of those things that everybody knows about it, probably has a friend or a relative that is in such a job and potentially taking advantage of it, milking the system. Some do it to a further extent than others. Some show up and they're getting paid a check for essentially doing nothing, but at least they still show up and they do what is technically asked of them. Others don't even show up and get somebody to sign the book for them. That's just another example. I am sure just about anybody that could hear the sound of my voice right now, plus the rest of the population for all intents and purposes, knows someone doing that, has heard stories of that happening. And yet there is no will to really do anything about it. And to some extent, this is one of the reasons why I am not totally on board with giving senior public officials raises, because one would think holding their subordinates accountable. And listen, let's just take the police back an example. It's not for Erla to hold police constable X accountable. She's supposed to hold, at the very least, or at the lowest, the divisional heads accountable, right? They themselves now have to hold, their station heads accountable. And so on down the line. If a constable isn't doing the wrong thing, the commissioner is not necessarily going to get her involved unless it is something of great significance. With that individual thing, the commissioner is going to go up the ladder to say, hey, there are too many reports of too many bad apples in your situation. You are my subordinate. I will deal with you if you are not going to deal with them. It trickles down. We don't see that. Now, maybe one could argue, and people in the police service have said on this show, you're not going to see certain HR things, and I understand that. But the fact of the matter is, without seeing positive results in a reduction in this type of behavior, one could argue the behavior to try to rectify it behind closed doors is not happening. We already have situations with the public service that needs to be updated for the current modern times. Laws, regulations, policies, a lot of things need to be updated. Systems to deal with new innovations, new ways of doing things needs to be updated. But holding employees accountable to just do your job is timeless. It's obvious and it should be expected. But to what extent is it not happening? All right. In this case, while it doesn't wipe away the bad, it is a couple of good points and maybe strategically published to be so. But kudos to the AG, despite all of my questions of past incidents. In this case, at the very least, on the surface, it seems like this situation is being rectified. But it leads me to another question. But we'll get into that with today's Daily Review. This issue with the Registrar General's office in Tobago, it's one that brings up a certain concept or ideology that I think is not formally concretized in the national conversation, but it's always there bubbling beneath the surface. And that is with regards to the relationship between Trinidad and Tobago. One country, two islands, which is a very complicated situation because the two islands are not of equal size nor of equal population. So technically, in many ways, Tobago does not have anywhere near the needs of Trinidad, except it's a separate island, so in some cases, it has the same needs, with regards to Trinidad. Travel between the two islands more or less requires essentially the same thing. You need to have an air bridge, you need to have a ferry service, right? And the needs of Tobago, technically because it's a separate island, is greater than other areas of the country which are subsections of Trinidad. But it seems as though while there are some true complicated aspects of the nature of how we deal or treat with the needs of one island compared to the needs of the whole nation, I do fear that this issue is now, it's more of a political one than an actual practical one. So, of course, we had the Tobago autonomy bills being presented to Parliament on Monday. One bill was not voted for, and it has more or less stalled the other bill. The AG has said that they're going back to the drawing board with regards to Tobago autonomy because the opposition did not support it. And I understand that. One of my questions is, to what extent are they going back to the drawing board? Are they starting from scratch, which I fear might be necessary in this case? Or are they just going to see what they have and tweak a little bit and try and you know, present it again and hope for the best? Now, the thing about this issue, and it goes back to the situation with the Registrar General, because the AHA basically had to say that this is not any attempt to colonize Tobago. I want to make sure I'm not to recolonize Tobago. Apparently he used that word. I would like to impress on the public the suggestions of wanting to control everything from Trinidad or to recolonize Tobago through the Registrar General Department reflects an alarming lack of understanding of the law or a complete disregard of the responsibilities of leadership. Maybe he could have been a little bit less attacking in his statement. But that's the thing, the sentiment immediately went to that. Central government don't like us. Now, I would argue that areas to the east and to the south and maybe even to the northeast and to the north of Trinidad and central Trinidad and even like places like Arima, like a lot of places across Trinidad will have similar sentiments to Tobago. Not always to the same degree because, again, separate island complicates the thing. But this whole situation now where it seems as though issues are being used by politicians in Tobago to basically say, well, who are we going to blame? We could blame each other and we could blame Trinidad. And there comes a point where I do have to ask, because one of the reasons why I say that the Tobago autonomy issue, maybe they might have to start completely from scratch is the lack of any definition of what autonomy means. What is it? What are the details? What exactly is being asked for? Because I honestly, despite the fact that I very much will not let the AudioGate scandal go, and I do believe that the Chief Secretary has a lot to answer for with regards to the implications of that scandal, and he's essentially, in my opinion, been left off the hook, but it is what it is. I actually don't want to necessarily come down on him. I don't have an agenda. I don't want him to lose his position. I don't want his party to fail. I actually do feel, regardless of that scandalous audio recording, the TPP is still important to the future of our democracy and our democratic process maturing. Now, whether or not they continue to be a long-term fixture of our democratic process, that's up to them. But they represent something that we don't have enough of, and that is an alternative that is not necessarily held down by baggage of years and decades of the same old, which has gotten us to where we are. And that's one of the things. The more they act like their predecessors and their peers, the more I am concerned. Now, in this case, however, it's not necessarily the chief sec that I want to highlight here and say, oh God, how he could say that, but rather the fact that his messaging over this autonomy issue has itself, I believe, confused the situation potentially beyond repair, which is why I say maybe it needs to be started from scratch. Because, and maybe I did not put it all together well enough, so I'm going to continue to try until I feel satisfied that I have. How is it that one source of messaging, one individual, is going to have the following series of messages over one issue? The bill is not sufficient enough and doesn't meet the needs of the people of Tobago. That's number one. Number two, you didn't pass the bill, it's your fault. But the people who didn't pass the bill that he's blaming are the people who actually voted for the bill. A bill that was not sufficient enough to begin with. So exactly what is he complaining about? He's complaining about the bill not being sufficient enough, but then when it didn't pass, he's blaming the people who actually voted for the bill. What is it that he's asking for? Because he wants the bill that's not sufficient or not good enough to pass, and he's blaming the people that voted for the bill that's not sufficient enough for the wants and needs of Tobago. I don't really know what his stance is anymore, except the one thing that comes out of this is he's basically trying to blame the PNM from every angle on this issue. Either blame the PNM or blame central government, but he's kept the UNC out of his mouth. Now, if he had a much clearer, coherent message, then the verbal outrage that he expressed, that he still took licks for, may have been more understandable. But I feel part of the reason why no one has given him any leeway with regards to the house slave statement is because his messaging is, with regards to the issue on a technical level, all over the place, with regards to assigning blame pointed at only one side. How is it that you're going to blame a bill not passing and not hold both sides of Parliament to account for not coming together to find a middle ground to pass something? That's point number one. But then point number two, based on the fact that you're saying the bill is not sufficient anyway, any sort of middle ground compromise probably is not going to be sufficient anyway. So then it leads me back to the point where, to what extent are politicians using this as a political football? And let me get, some people might not understand what that means. Let me get the definition here, if my computer would stop sticking. A political football is a topic or issue that is seized on by opposing political parties or factions and made to be more of a political issue than it might initially seem to be. Because we've heard a little bit here and there about how some Tobagonians, their opinions are not necessarily in line with the strong opinions expressed by some politicians involved in this matter. To what extent is that true, I don't know. Which is why I go back to the point where I'm not saying that it needs to be scrapped. If it was that we had clear indications that the majority of Tobagonians did not care about this issue anywhere near the way that the politicians did, then I would just say scrap the thing. But it's not clear what Tobagonians want. And at this point, I don't care what the politicians have to say. Right? The politicians that are not PNM have, in the past, at the very least, disagreed on the amount of consultations that's taken place and the veracity of the information used to make these bills. So we don't even have a clear narrative from the side that is not the government. And given the fact that the TPP's leader has not given me a coherent message, I have to wonder to what extent if this is more of a political issue than an actual issue of the people to address the needs of the people. One of the reports basically said that, and let me get the line here, some people believe political games and poor planning caused its failure, while others argue the bills wouldn't have helped ordinary people. And that's part of the problem. I don't even think anyone has even attempted to take the time to explain to anybody how the concept of Tobago autonomy will help ordinary people in their day-to-day lives. The American election pointed out to the fact you could have all the idealistic word salad mumbo-jumbo you want, but if people are feeling it in their wallets, they're not going to vote for you if you're part of the incumbent problem that caused issues with their paychecks not being sufficient enough to meet the needs month to month. How is it that Tobago autonomy is going to help Tobagonians live a better life, afford to put food on the table, make it easier to do certain things in their day-to-day existence? Where are those explanations? Instead, what we get from all sides, including the PNM, is, well, Tobago wants autonomy for Tobago. Because we are disrespected, because we need a certain amount of self-governance. Even the term self-governance, what exactly does that mean? Because at least the TPP is consistent on this stance, as far as I know, and maybe they're moving away from it, but they're saying we don't want independence. And I could understand that. The question, asking for independence is a whole other kettle of fish with implications and consequences that might not be good in the long run for either side, but especially for Tobago. Now, that leads me to another point. The head of the PDP and former Deputy Chief Sec, there's an interesting quote, and this is to tell you how confusing this issue is and how unclear this issue is, and to the extent of the word salad of this issue. Tobagonians, this is the quote of Watson Duke in one daily newspaper. Tobagonians, once Tobagonians have made that choice via everyone having a vote, we must consider all three issues. Our independence, autonomy is one of the issues, or an association with Trinidad as independent countries. So we have not been able to look at those three areas, only autonomy, 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 and that is a misconception that Tobago rejects autonomy. Tobago, we need to hear about the two other areas until Tobago have had that full and fair discussion among itself, and we decide for ourselves. Now, the issue I have with this statement, bad grammar notwithstanding, all three issues are independence, autonomy is one of the issues, or an association with Trinidad as independent countries. Well, independence and association with Trinidad as independent countries technically means the same thing. So I wonder if what Nuke is trying to say with regards to the first one, our independence meaning we cut each other off. We have nothing to do with each other. Because an association as independent countries, I don't know if Mr. Duke is aware of this, but essentially, hello, welcome to how independent countries operate because they have association with other independent countries. This is basically normal diplomacy with other countries. Independent countries have association. The norm is having association with other independent countries when you're independent. The exception is cutting ties with a country because of whatever extreme circumstance. So he has presented two issues, called it three. It's confusing. I'm trying to interpret his words here, but it makes me wonder if he's trying to speak at the top of his head, but then he's trying to like make sure he doesn't say certain things to undermine his position. And to me, it's confusing. Maybe other people think it's straightforward, but he said there are three issues when he technically only presents two. Unless, of course, as I said just now, one of the things that he says Tobagonians need to consider is severance of all ties with Trinidad, cut off all association with Trinidad. And then what? Or rather, if you have a very specific definition of what association with Trinidad as independent countries mean, it would benefit you to explain the details. And it goes back to the whole thing about this Tobago autonomy debate. Because he said all that word salad, that's nice. What does that mean? What does that mean for the people? How does it benefit them? Directly and indirectly. But in any way, what are the details? And that's what's being lost in this autonomy debate. And the fact of the matter is, and this is why it's an issue, not just that it's being used as a political football, to essentially pit whatever supporting base of whatever party against each other. One, I think it is continuing to drive a wedge between the two islands that does not have to exist. And two, the longer this word salad of an autonomy debate that is undefined in any real definitive terms, detailed to say how legally, economically, socially and culturally, this will benefit Tobago first and to some extent Trinidad. Until that has happened, this process is ongoing. How much money is being spent to conduct these consultations and to draft these bills and to do these studies and to crunch the numbers and not just the money being spent, because you would say, well, those people had to work, right? Well, a lot of those people could be doing other things. Their production could be, assuming that they do work and they don't just collect a check and not show up, their production could be utilized in other areas of governance. So it's either a real monetary bill that we're footing for this political nonsense, or the opportunity costs, regardless, either way, time waits on no one. It's not as though we could afford excess anymore. The days of us being able to afford nonsense are over. Right now, we have the CAL pilots, they, I believe, just took 4%, and they're negotiating their wage, more on that maybe in a little bit. Well, actually, no, I'll have to cut it here. They're negotiating for a wage 2015 to 2020. They've been operating for 9 years without a collective bargaining agreement. And they haven't negotiated for even all of those 9 years. That is ridiculous. So, I don't have a say, I don't have a vote. But in my opinion, this whole thing about autonomy needs to start from the bottom up, from scratch, with a proper foundation laid with regards to what are the objectives, what are we trying to achieve, and then fill in the details now in the bill with how it will be achieved. But don't hold your breath, because it seems as though all parties involved, well, for the PNM, it's an election ploy. For the TPP, the UNC, and the PDP, I don't know to what extent it's an election ploy or just an answer to the PNM bringing it out once again to kind of float and see what happens. Let's take that break. When we come back, we should be welcoming my colleagues. Stay tuned.
Transform your home with PCU Plus. From stylish furniture to the latest appliances, we have everything you need to create your perfect space. At PCU Plus, we offer fair prices and affordable financing options that are cheaper than hire purchase agreements. With convenient locations in San Fernando, Tobago, Arima, and our lifestyle showroom in Barataria, you're never far from the best deals. Visit PCU Plus today and discover why we're the top choice for quality furniture and appliances. PCU Plus. Quality you trust, prices you'll love. Visit one of our locations or find us online to start transforming your home today.
Simon's Musical Supplies Limited. We are the specialist in new and used musical instruments, carrying top brands like Yamaha, Pearl River pianos, vinyl and Sabian cymbals, Remo and Evans drumheads and Fender guitars, just to name a few. Also a wide assortment of music books, pan and accessories. At Simon's, we service what we sell. Trust the leader. Call us now at 625-6412 or visit us at 20 Board Street, Port of Spain.
Cogería si cogió la desgracia, que golpe golpe no llevaría, qué golpe no llevaría, una mujer me llamaba, pero yo no le...
I'm back here talking about the WSND Content Capital. Apologies, my colleague is not able to join us just yet. Power issues. I mean, you know, people say water for all. To some extent, we also have to be concerned about electricity for all. I'm just saying, we can't afford what we used to. And even when we could, water for all and electricity for all was not something that we could have reliably expected anytime soon. Then, what about now? That said, I want to jump to, I mentioned it just now recently before the break. I want to jump to one of our third story for the day, and then maybe we'll get back on track. And that is with regards to the negotiations that the Pilots Association had with Caribbean Airlines. Now, a couple of things happened. There were multiple stories throughout this week with regards to the whole situation. The pilots were potentially threatening to disrupt service. They were complaining that the airline was acting in bad faith with the negotiations, in part because they attempted to remove a clause that allowed for the paying of salaries in US dollars, from which, based on one of the reports, my understanding is that they weren't necessarily being paid in US dollars, but one of the issues is that they are looking at other airlines and trying to compare their salaries with them. The clause for US dollars is not necessarily just to get US dollars as their salaries, but rather, if our currency fluctuates, it's intended to guarantee that their compensation remains at whatever level it's supposed to be in relation to international pilot salaries. Now, apparently, compared to one other regional airline in a part of the Caribbean, our pilots are being paid, I think somewhere like Cayman Islands, Jet, are being paid 9 cents on the dollar, 10% less, right? But, I mean, at the end of the day, that's what's negotiated for. Even though they're being paid less, they want to ensure that it maintains. If our currency bottoms out, then they don't want their salaries essentially to bottom out. In part, I guess, because as airline pilots, they may be depending on their salary from CAL to maintain a semi-international lifestyle, right? In part because as they fly all over the world, they're going to have to make connections, operate in different cities, you know, maybe you have to pay for goods and services abroad for temporary holdovers, etc. And if our currency bottoms out, all of a sudden their purchasing power, when forced to go abroad, is going to be a lot less. That's just part of it. Also, to some extent, they are, I believe, generally speaking, CAL pilots are earning less to stay here and fly for CAL. At one point, there were talks about pilot shortages with regards to China taking a lot of pilots from Western Airlines, so Western Airlines had pilot shortages. Potentially, that would have been a way for CAL pilots to say, well, if you're not going to pay us what we think we're worth, we could try our hand elsewhere and potentially be paid more. But it seems as though one of the reasons why they didn't do that is the fact that some of these pilots just want to stay home. Just like the whole advertising marketing campaign that Caribbean Airlines has continued. So that clause, apparently, according to one paper, is still in the agreement that has been signed as per the most recent reports. So all of the potential contention over the last couple of weeks, apparently they have been able to come together. First of all, I'm very happy to see that, all right, we may have issues, right? But for whatever reason, the government was able to step in, potentially in a positive way. We don't know to what extent it was necessary. The Prime Minister told the Minister of Finance, hey, go in there. He said, hey, give them the 4%. And assuming that's what was offered and that was good enough for the pilots, they signed the agreement. Yes, they may have said we may have to take industrial action or do what have you. But this was not like an ongoing thing for a few months. It took a couple of weeks. They got it done. As soon as issues came up, apparently they were addressed, I assume, relatively speaking. My issue is, And yes, I guess part of it is the good faith. The pilots are saying, we're not asking for the moon here. We just want something that we think is reasonable. And I assume that they signed the collective bargaining agreement, so it is reasonable. But I brought up the issue, my main issue with this whole fiasco. And this is, again, what did I say? Things that happen in one sector, see, they spread to the others. Maybe I'm naive, but I do not understand how an entity will continue to operate when the collective bargaining agreement that it was operating under expires. That is to say, the agreement by which pilots and employers operate under has expired. And I don't know if this, to some extent, is the employees, in this case, the pilots, giving too much grounds or concessions to Carl. But we have seen this in other areas where it seems as though we have too many people that are not allowed to not work when certain aspects of their employment contract has not been negotiated, so they continue to work. And a lot of the issues we have with pay raises right now is not about current salaries per se. We're talking about negotiations happening in 2024 for raises for periods in 2015, 2016, etc. And I find that to be practically ridiculous. Because by saying we could take 9 years to sort this out, we will never do anything on a timely manner. Now again, I don't know if it's because it's the status of pilots, port workers, police officers, fire service officers. They can't strike, they can't walk off the job, they can't whatever. But to some extent, while those laws are cute, and in some cases very, very, very applicable, at the end of the day, at least with regards to the pilots, and this is what gets me, pilots don't have to fly here. It's not so easy for a police officer or a fireman to go abroad. They'll have to, I don't know if they need to get citizenship, they would have to go through all kind of legal hoops and probably have to go through basic training and so forth again, all over again. What they want to do that, I don't know. But for an airline pilot, yes, you'll have to recertify and checks with the airlines and go through all of that. But it's a lot less academic. I mean, nurses go to England all the time because they're fed up with what's going on down here. At one point, where we had risk of our pilots abandoning us because they were fed up with the whole dog and pony show. And part of the reason why it takes so long is that I guess maybe the employer side of the equation allows it to happen. But regardless of why it happens, I think it's, dare I say, insane. And it is one of the things that is contributing to a poor working environment when we're still trying to figure out what are the terms and conditions for 9 years that you have already worked for. Because the thing is, and again, this is why I wonder if I'm naive and idealistic, because the only example that comes to mind for me this morning is a sports example, where when the collective bargaining agreement, in American sports at least, is over, the players don't play. They threaten not to play, and all of a sudden, the efficiency of everyone involved increases dramatically, and they get the work done to get an agreement done. Because did it take 9 years to get this agreement done? Or did it take the last couple of months maybe to get this agreement done? And if that's the case, why couldn't it have been done in 2015? Why was it only done now? And then the best part is they signed an agreement for 2015-2020. We still have 21, 22, 23, 24. Going into 25, what about those years? When will those years be settled? Because I would think that if we like to do things properly, we would settle terms and conditions before the work is done. Even if it's a norm in TNT, or the British Westminster system, or English common law, part of me wants to say, why should it be? Why should this be a norm? Because something tells me it makes the situation worse on a whole host of levels. The employer already got the productivity. They are not necessarily incentivized to pay more for past contracts. The employees already lived on those salaries, so the justification of we can't live on these salaries for those years no longer exists. If you want to say that I can't live on 2016 salaries in 2024, that's fine. But you can't say I can't live on 2016 salaries in 2020. You already did it. You lose that leverage. Unless a dirty little secret of Trinidad and Tobago is that we are anti-labor despite what the industrial courts do and say. And we don't care about the working class people, or in this case, the pilots who are not technically working class, but it's not as though pilots have like a whole hierarchy of junior pilots under them when they fly a plane. They have to do technically the manual work of flying the plane. They have a junior pilot with them, one, but that's to some extent as much as a colleague as it is a subordinate. But I mean, you know, we like to do things on Trinity time. I just didn't realize Trinity time was so late. Again, somebody could call in and say this is how things are done. I don't know if I'm going to be willing to accept that just because this is how we do things here means that it's right. Now, if someone has an explanation as to why this is right and practical and beneficial, then fine. I am all ears. I would like to hear it. I think this is nuts. I do. Because, and we hear this across the board, when negotiations are being done for wage increases, it's not even to bring up what the current salaries are up to today. Usually time period is some time period in the past, which means that this is a can that's continually kicked down the line. Half the time you have, well, no, I wouldn't say that. But I do wonder to what extent, I think in some extreme cases, they were negotiating for salaries in years that was under a different administration. In fact, if the PNM lost the last election, essentially that's what would have had to happen with regards to the pilots and other public sector workers or workers of entities owned by the government. And I said it already, I think it's ridiculous. I think it is. Why can't we do these things in a timely manner? Collective bargaining agreement is over. The terms and conditions are over. The last raises we've got, okay, it's done. The compensation package needs to be updated. Let's update it now so that employees could benefit now. I know they get back pay, but because it's sad, I don't know if it was because the government said we had no money, so we don't want to do it just yet, and everybody said, okay, fine, we'll wait. And this is a unique phenomenon with regard to the PNM and this current iteration due to this economy, which essentially started around that time, but still. What is with this thing about kicking responsibilities down the line? I don't understand. Let's move on back up to the second story now. I want to mention this before we open up the phone lines. Trinidad has signed 5 agreements with the United States, a couple of which, 2 to 3 of which are quite important, and I think is part of our political, international, diplomatic, well, to put it very simplistically, the game we're playing, the moves we're making. Our National Security Minister signed off on 5 agreements with the U.S. 2 days ago. At least 2 or 3 allow for the U.S. Department of Defense to deploy forces to TNT in the event of a conflict with Venezuela. But also it allows deployments for natural disasters, emergency relief, and the like. Two of those agreements, one which apparently is an ongoing thing, so it was more like a renewal, the Status of Forces Agreement. It allows or facilitates interoperability between the 2, well, essentially nations' militaries, right? Because that's a tricky thing. 2 entities, how do we work together? What are the nature of our relationship? How do we report? Who has authority over what? How do we resolve conflicts or disagreements, etc., etc.? And this is an agreement that I believe is around the world. The U.S. has these agreements to smooth things over and not try to do things informally and unofficially, but have official frameworks with how their defense force and personnel interact with our personnel. One of the other agreements is the acquisition and cross-servicing agreement, which helps with logistics, which is very important. It's important in the sense of it will allow for formal logistic mechanisms to exchange logistical support, supplies, and services directly between eligible countries and international organizations. A lot of this is bureaucratic red tape being cut, being, streamlined. Now, this is a very, very, very subtle thing. This is a very, on the surface, minor thing. But I do think it essentially sends a message to Washington saying, look, we're not siding with Venezuela versus the U.S. on any conflict between Venezuela and the U.S. just so, right? We have our deal. We want our deal. We need you to not penalize us for our deal with regards to drug and gas. We're not necessarily trying to pull the wool over our eyes and ignore the potential risks that Venezuela potentially proposes. Guyana has one of those agreements as well. Given what's going on with SQO, the United States, of course, is looking at the whole situation. Guyana has the status of forces agreement with the U.S. as well. So potentially intervention could come if SQO becomes a hot conflict. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the United States will come in uninvited. They still, to some extent, need permission. The deals could be reneged at any time. One of the key things is the U.S. could also end the agreements as well. But I do believe it's a sign saying, look, we are still wanting to work with you. We still understand the overall situation, the ramifications of everything, the political and diplomatic and security reality of what's going on here. And this is one of those things where we hopefully will never need it. But if we do need it, we'll be very happy to have it. It's like insurance. But also, just by having the agreements, because there were three other agreements: the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, Technical Assistance Field Team, the Treaty of San Jose, and Southcom Human Rights Initiative. Not all of those things are necessarily pointed at Venezuela. And even the other two agreements are not necessarily pointed at Venezuela, because they also help in terms of non-defense concerns, like I said, natural disasters, deployment, and the like. Because again, it will cut the red tape with regards to they could access logistical support and supplies from local sources, as well as our government, and how they would interact with our personnel. It also helps clear up certain legal issues with regards to civilian employees of the Department of Defense, not civilian contractors. So there are benefits for this, not just, Venezuela. But to some extent, and the way how these treaties work, you will do an open agreement like that has more applications, but you're signing it at a time when there's a clear and specific risk in the area, and everybody kind of knows one or two of those things are technically, if not directly pointed at said risk. It's understood that that's one of the things at the forefront of the mind to get these agreements done. Hopefully, this does not necessarily cause a reaction out of the Maduro regime. That is unreasonable, because one would think they should understand what the game is as well. Sometimes a lot of the threats and bluster are literally threats and bluster, and the people involved are smart enough to know how far they could push it and when to back off. But we are, once again, because I've said this before, we have successfully, at least on the surface, we don't necessarily know what the individual countries, what their stance is, but at least the appearance is that we successfully have played China and America. We've played it in the middle to some extent. Of course, we have a lot of ties to both countries. We're not trying to do anything to sever those ties, but we're not going to sacrifice one alliance, or maybe alliance is too strong of a word, but one friendship with another, or one set of dealings with another. And now, I guess this is part of the diplomacy to show America, hey, it's not like we want to go against you on this issue. We understand the risks, but we're going to take a neutral stance. We're going to be reasonable to both sides as much as possible. And please, 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 please renew our OFAC license. Also, again, there's a very, very small chance that we might need this insurance somewhere down the road, and I'm happy to have it if we do, and I hope we never need it, and I don't expect we'll ever need it, but like I said, I'm happy to have it. The irony of what I think to be, at the very least, a minor success on the diplomatic front is, it proves all of my callers who say politicians are smart right. Because internationally, it seems as though we make reasonably good decisions. I'm not saying that they're the best decisions, but I think it's reasonably good enough that I don't have a problem with it. And I don't necessarily know how they could be better. I don't have the details, so I don't know what could be improved upon. There are always going to be a lot of fine details that we're not going to know with regards to these things, right? But they're smart, and they know how to be smart, because when dealing with other countries, they ain't going to necessarily accept the nonsense that we do internally. So then the question comes, why is it that when you're dealing with people outside the house, you know how to have restraint and to be polite and to be diplomatic and to show grace. But when you come home and you're with your family, you're short-tempered, you don't have tolerance, you're quick to anger and shout and carry on and scream. That's the analogy. The reality is, why is it that they have so much bubble internally, not so much bubble externally? We're not involved in bubble externally. We is everybody friend. And we maintain a very good friendship with everybody. We don't step on nobody's toes. But here, home, we step on everybody's toes. Everybody step on everybody's toes. Why? All right. It's an interesting position that we find ourselves in, and I do wonder if to what extent we may, as we run out of oil and gas, our political relevance may soon run out. But maybe security-wise, like certain places in the Middle East, these sort of agreements will keep our strategic importance in the region, at least with one big player. That could be the other thing, the other side benefit. We are the southernmost Caribbean island. Anything that goes on in Venezuela, we are right next door. It's both a need and an opportunity. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll open the phone lines. Maybe my colleague will have power back. Don't expect it to happen. But stay tuned. We open the phone lines anyway to hear from you, the viewer, after this.
Transform your home with PCU Plus. From stylish furniture to the latest appliances, we have everything you need to create your perfect space. At PCU Plus, we offer fair prices and affordable financing options that are cheaper than hire purchase agreements. With convenient locations in San Fernando, Tobago, Arima, and our lifestyle showroom in Barataria, you're never far from the best deals. Visit PCU Plus today and discover why we're the top choice for quality furniture and appliances. PCU Plus. Quality you trust, prices you'll love. Visit one of our locations or find us online to start transforming your home today.
Maybe he landed here totally by coincidence. But if by chance he's admiring your fresh coat of Benjamin Moore soft sky blue, well, that's a pretty high compliment. Coming from an expert.
Here's your chance to win a bicycle, a ride-on, or a hoverboard. Shop at dbesttoys.com and spend $300 or more to win big.
We've got Barbie,
Hot Wheels, Gel Blasters, Ride-ons,
Leapfrog,
Nerf, bicycles and tricycles.
Greco, and Wonder Baby.
Visit us in store at Forces Flagship McBean, Louis Vuitton Port of Spain,
Eastgate Mall and M6 Plaza Endeavour.
Merry Christmas, everyone!
And we're back here on talking about another WSND Connect Capital Show. Michael Small here, opening up the phone lines. Just a reminder, when you are on the air, if you call in, please mute your TV. Do not try to have the conversation through the television. I understand you want to follow the show until we put the call on air. I get that, but then you need to mute your TV once you realize you're on the air through the phone. Have the conversation through the phone. We have our first caller for the morning, San Fernando. Good morning, caller. You're on the air.
Good morning, Sean.
Morning.
Two things I want to touch on this morning. You talked about the salary increase for the TTALPA employees or the TTALPA members with Caribbean Airlines. You know, one of the situations with that is this, the reason why a lot of them have, you talked about the salaries on the international markets, and the reason why they haven't left, a lot of them, is because the salaries are way above average in Trinidad and Tobago. Do you know the senior pilots in Caribbean Airlines? Some of them make more than the Chief Justice, and some of them make more than the Prime Minister and the President. A lot of that is happening. So I understand the part with the US dollar salary thing, because what happens is that they get the flight crew on the whole. Once they fly out of the jurisdiction, which is we call the air bridge, they get allowances.
Mm-hmm.
And those allowances are paid in US dollars because they have to, when they go abroad, they have to eat. If they overnight, they will go to New York, they go, any of those flights, they have to get stuff. They have to, because they don't pay for their meals. They pay for the hotels, but not the meals. So
right.
they have to. So that is paid in US dollars. And I think what Caribbean Airlines was trying to do is to try and say, we want to pay at NTT as well. And I think that is unfair.
Yeah.
So I agree with that. I do agree with them on that. Now, so as I said, a lot of that, if you look at their salaries are way above average. And hence the reason why that statement you made about 2020 already passed and you lived on 2020 salaries. And do you know, during the COVID, when they weren't flying, the pilots were paid 50% of their salaries for the entire time Caribbean Airlines was not flying. So there's a lot of things you have to take into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that being said, I want to go to the Tobago autonomy issue. I think a lot of people have not read that Tobago autonomy bill to understand, to put things in perspective. And I wish a lot of people would read it, everybody, including Trinidadians and Tobagonians. Now, in that proposal, Sean, right, let me just say this about the what you call it, the amount of money that they were given, the 6.8% of the national budget. If you extrapolate those numbers, right? If you're using a figure of 65,000 for the population of Tobago, I saw Kelvin Morris said 60,000. But if you use 65,000, right? And you do a per capita extrapolation and you take the national budget, which was the last one I was read, which was 59 billion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Almost 60 billion, 59.7 billion, and you extrapolate it by population size. Do you know, with that 6.8%, Tobago would get, with using 65,000, Tobago would get about $63,000 per person, or per capita. and Trinidad would get 39,000 per capita. Those are the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
A lot more than what we would have to run Trinidad with. And so I'm trying to understand, okay, if you look at the schedules, in the Tobago Autonomy Bill, the first and the second schedule of what would be the PHA would be responsible for
Mm-hmm.
in this last bill. I think that is where the problem is. I feel that Farley and they want the 6.8%, but they don't want the additional responsibility, because that 6.8% comes with additional responsibility, things that the central government will no longer be responsible for, that they would be responsible for. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. And as you rightly said, you hit the nail on the head from the beginning. They need to define what autonomy means to them. And that is where the crux of the matter is. That is where the conundrum. And I'm so glad that you put it in the forefront. They need to define what autonomy means to them. When I say autonomy, what all you want? Tell me exactly what you want, and then let's speak. So, as the Attorney General said, it will really have to start over from scratch. And my last point is, I am amazed that they have kept the opposition out of this. I am amazed that I listened to Farley talk and he had a sit down yesterday with two reporters in Tobago there, and it seems as if when he wants to blame, he says the Parliament. He not pinpointing the opposition. He says the Parliament, as if the people on one side did not vote for the as if all the members in the Parliament did not vote for the bill. Trying to conflate the matter. Have a good day, Sean.
Thank you, caller. Yes, the UNC is technically on their side on the issue, but they don't seem to agree on certain things, or at least they did not with regards to consultations. And more importantly, the UNC is not popular in Tobago. So it's very interesting. I think this is where the politics comes in, where he's trying to blame Trinidad, but he doesn't want to make it seem like he's on the side of the UNC, but technically he is, but technically he isn't. It's very, very confusing. And yes, when I say Parliament, I almost always follow it up, and I think I say it enough that even if I don't say it, it's implied. I mean both sides. I don't just mean the government whenever I say Parliament. And usually I will say both sides, because government, technically, legally, does not just mean the majority of Parliament, that is to say the PNM majority. It also includes the minority opposition, the UNC. And they had a part to play in not passing the bill. And then what makes it worse is the fact that, yes, the UNC are the ones that actually did not vote for the bill in the first place. So on the very, 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 very surface, how could you blame Parliament and not mention the UNC at all? And that's why I said it makes me think he's pointing all the blame that he can to the PNM, which I get it, that's the political opponent on the issue, or that's the political opponent as they, the politicians in total, present the issue. But with regards to the actual issue itself, everybody wants it. How come it can't get done? We have Digger Martin on the line. Good morning, caller, you're on here.
Good morning, Sean.
Morning.
A couple of issues, and I was hoping that Karen would have been on today, so we could have further developed a conversation we had the last time she was on it.
But caller, she was on yesterday.
All right, well, I missed her because I wasn't around.
Yeah.
But I wanted to talk about the current leadership of the country and his diminishing leadership in the CARICOM, how it has affected cricket West Indies. He has been given the leadership of a subcommittee for cricket, and now it is turmoil. Cricket West Indies is supposed to have had a meeting, and it has collapsed because Barbados is not part of it. Saying if he showed leadership before this fiasco happened, he would have gotten all the players involved into it. And he tells me his leadership is a hands-off. Let it fall where they are. The other thing I want to discuss, the SRC and giving the Prime Minister a very high salary. I wonder if they took into consideration his year-long travel and the per diem he gets for that, because that is a huge sum of money. And for the TALPA, we cannot benchmark certain jobs with other jobs. For example, in the oil field, the risk and reward is there. If you're an employee in the oil field, the risk is much higher than a civil servant. If you are a pilot, your risk is much higher than an average citizen. So the risk and reward, that is how it goes. And you can't be vexed with it. And the major thing I want to think, we just celebrated 16 days of activism with respect to gender-based violence. And I wanted to know how we responded to it based on the utterances of the Prime Minister at a previous engagement. I think you remember this community talk when he said, and he basically alluded to blaming the victim. He's not in the bedroom and he's not that type of person. How his utterances and his leadership role in trying to manage this grave issues we face with respect to gender violence, and I'm specifically talking about how we responded to that lady who was found hanging and was bruised and apparently murdered. I ain't seen no hiding alert for the TTPS to go after the perpetrator of that heinous crime. Go on, have a nice morning.
Okay, we have Shogunas in line that's been waiting, so I'll take that caller, then I'll respond to those points. Good morning, caller, you're on the air.
Good morning, Sean.
Morning, morning.
You said something to the effect that we can no longer afford certain things. And I disagree with you.
Well,
we never can afford bad government. We can never afford wastage and things like that. Because that is what caused the bad times to come. Right? As regards the Tobago principle, I have always pointed out that Tobago is a local government authority. And its creation did not follow our principles for local government power, in that our local government is based on the principle that the area should be able to raise monies to deal with certain basic infrastructure. That is why the city of Port of Spain came up first, then you had San Fernando, Arriba, and so forth. Tobago came here because they could not afford basic infrastructure. And then some people sit down and lie and say it was made a ward of Trinidad, which is not true. This was pointed out by the big historian in UWI, that it was made a ward of the combined governmental principle of Trinidad and Tobago. And it's because this gives rise to endless wastage in Tobago. This has been documented over years. I mean, one of them is to have about 70% of the population employed by government. And the work that these people were supposed to do, they're still giving it out in contract. Makes no sense. We talk about water, and water for all and all these things. That is what caused the problem. In the old days, the water authorities, because there was a large number before Williams amalgamated them into the WASA, they were able to cover the cost of running water. The government just planned the cost of providing the service, right? And before these authorities put water in the area, they would check out the potential revenue and see that it could afford it. Now we just put water for, now the reason for that is because you will have sometimes 2 or 3 houses way in the bush, and the cost of carrying the water, the cost of servicing a whole community. We have stopped all these things. And all these are principles of government, which we had ignored. You could change principles, but you must have to say something how this new one is better than the old one. Any questions?
No, caller. You bring up an interesting point. With that last point that I want to comment on. but I don't have any questions. How to put it? I actually understand where you're coming from, where to some extent, any random person can't just say, I'm going to put a very small house. I can't afford to source water on my own, so I expect the government to run a whole set of infrastructure to me, even though I'm isolated by myself. To what extent is that fair and right? Because yes, the land is cheap because they don't have infrastructure there, but if the government isn't ready to say it's going to be a development for a new community, private individuals buy land to build houses because we're going to put infrastructure in this area. If you're just saying, I'm going to settle here, well, if you want to do that in other parts of the world, I do believe they deal with their needs for themselves. If someone makes a cabin in a random spot in Alaska, they find their own water. They don't expect the government of Alaska to get them running water. Now, that's an extreme example.
Yes.
But, all right, thank you, caller. Yeah, what could Tobago afford on its own? The thing is, and therein lies the complexity, right? It's a word of the state, but what is the state? The state is not the state of Trinidad, right? It might be a play on semantics, but I do wonder if a lot of the issues come from semantics. And then what both the professor and Mr. San Fernando brought up is the economics of the thing. Now, I do think that, generally speaking, Tobago probably should get more per capita than citizens in Trinidad, just because of the added expense of having to ship things to Tobago and fly to Tobago and have to operate all of that. But to some extent, some of that actually extra expense should be within the subsidies for the sea bridge and the air bridge already. So how much more, right? Are those subsidies counted as money spent by Tobago or for Tobago with regards to the allotment? I don't think so. I think the budgetary allotment, this is one of those things, right, where with regards to autonomy, the subsidy for the air bridge and the sea bridge, if you're autonomous, now do you pay for the subsidy? Because there's less incentive or responsibility on Trinidad's part to pay for the subsidy. Because on Trinidad's part, people go to Tobago for recreation and business, yes, but to what extent is it a need of Trinidad's versus a need of Tobago's? Whereas if we do the correct thing and identify it as one country, then it's a need of the country, right? So this is where, the definitions and semantics, a lot of modern debate is not just on the issue, but how we define the issue, how we quantify the issue, how do we account for the issue, how we classify the issue, and the various details upon which that issue is made, how we classify them, how we measure them, where do we put this in what category compared to that? What is Tobago's responsibilities compared to Trinidad's? Now, I'm not entirely sure if Mr. San Fernando is right in saying that Farley Augustine and the TPP don't want additional responsibilities, they just want the 6.8%. If that is true, that would be very disingenuous because Farley has said he wants a federal system. That's one of the things that has come up recently. I don't think I've heard this before. And a federal system, to some extent, it's maybe a different version to what is technically already pre-existing, but perhaps it will come with certain other definitions and certain other technical implementations that would allow for minor differences, but maybe significant changes. And by saying that, it makes me think that he understands if we have a federal system, there are local responsibilities and, at least in the United States, state responsibilities, or let's go with Russia, oblast responsibilities. That's the only, forgive me, based on current news, that's the only other one that comes to mind. I think they might have similar things with regards to Germany, France, the UK and stuff, parish responsibilities or what have you, right? And things that you can't get away from if you want autonomy. One of the other things is Watson Duke brings up independence. He doesn't necessarily say that he wants independence or that he thinks Tobago wants independence, but he brings it up a lot more than others. So that and all says exactly why is he saying that? What is it that people want? Are there people that want independence? And I've said this before, I'll say it again. You want the 6.8%. You want the money based on the oil and gas fields that are in Tobago waters. What justifies or is the basis of your economy? If that's the basis of your economy now, what justifies it when that oil and gas runs out? Now, if the TPP wants to make a case that we want this to be the basis of our revenue now so that we could develop the island, improve the private sector, the tourism product, the agricultural sector, the chocolate manufacturing sector, etc., the wildlife preservation of the island for ecotourism, for cultural tourism, etc., improve the infrastructure of the roadworks, the waterworks, improve the educational facilities in the island so that our private sector is more robust and we could earn money for ourselves through tourism, through agriculture, through chocolate exports, through whatever else that they could come up with, fine. But I don't believe that case has yet to be made. So if we're depending on a resource that nationally has already proven to be finite, what are you going to do when it runs out? One of the reasons why education in Tobago needs to be improved is, generally speaking, I think we've done a poor job of educating the public with regards to the civic responsibilities of how we spend our national money, and that's why we had so much wastage in the past. Because the public, to some extent, allowed it to happen. And if Tobago wants to have a better course, and they've done step one, be willing to go with the people who at the very least are saying that they want to make change and things get better. And they're not going to do business as usual. Some of which has proven not always to be true because they have done things typical of politicians. Some of which has proven to be true. Because they're still technically not of that ilk. And it's not as though they could do change overnight. And I get it that they feel hamstrung. But the unfortunate reality is if you want to be part of a state called Trinidad and Tobago, that's just one of those things where who's responsible for what, who pays for what, and that is a common government issue. Who pays for what? It's not always so clear between one island versus another island, or rather the state versus a subsection of the state, because you can mentally or psychologically, emotionally, kind of say it as two separate islands, even though the state includes said smaller island. But usually, who pays for what could be with regards to different government departments, in particular, with regards to different subsections of the country, one state versus another, if there's a joint project, one town versus another, one municipality versus another, one parish versus another. But because we have this twin island dynamic, and it's complex by the sides that it's not actually identical twins, it is what it is. And instead of seeing leadership to bridge the gap, we see the divide being increased. I want to go to the Prime Minister's statement, and I'll end here. And this is one of the things. What I was trying to say about the Chief Secretary's statements over the recent chapter of autonomy that played out this week, it's not to attack him, but to highlight how the message is so unclear, and it confuses the issue. It obfuscates the issue. It does not help to clarify the issue. Messaging to the public has more than one consideration at all times. People will read into everything. The implications are endless. That is just the nature of public speaking. Don't blame me for it if you're not prepared to play in the big leagues, and as Chief Secretary, you are in almost the biggest of leagues because you run an executive for a whole island. You're not in Parliament, but for all intents and purposes, and this is where technically you're not on the national level, but in terms of importance, you're nationally important. So you want to play the semantics, but it doesn't matter to me. I'm not saying you're unimportant. I'm saying the reverse. You are important. So I could demand, even though I'm from Trinidad, for better to be done. And in the example of what the Prime Minister said with regards to domestic violence, the messaging in this case, when he said, "I am not in your bedroom," what he did, and I don't think it was intentional, but again, if you do something and it has unintended consequences, you can't blame people for reading into it that way. This is public speaking. You have to be aware of what you're saying and what you're implying. When he said, "I am not in your bedroom," he took a very pertinent and significant complicating factor for law enforcement. And he turned it into he is blaming the victim. And I do not fault anybody for that, for interpreting his words that way, because they shouldn't have never been said that way. But what he did was he took a very real subsection of the domestic violence issue that had a very much a need to have this complicated discussion, because our media ambassadors say it all the time. We need reports. We can't be physically in the house. We can't see everything that happens behind closed doors. But what he said is, I am not in your bedroom. He didn't even go to say the police are not in your bedroom, you know. He said, I am not in your bedroom, because he felt attacked that people are blaming him. And it's almost as though he does not fully appreciate you are the prime minister. The president could be the head of whatever you want to say she's the head of. The president, 99.9% of the time, is irrelevant. The buck stops at the prime minister. Yes, we know you're not in their bedrooms, but by saying it that way, you derail an important conversation point, because the authorities are trying to tell the people who are victims of domestic violence, listen, this is not like a robbery, where even if the store owner doesn't report it, the people around can see that it was robbed. There's evidence of the robbery out in the public to see. This is not like a murder where we discover a body. At the end of the day, we have to at least look into it, right? Domestic abuse happens behind closed doors. Police patrols are not going to detect it unless they just happen to be at exactly the right place at exactly the right time, and they're able to see or hear something behind closed doors through maybe a window or what have you. Perpetrators of domestic violence know to keep their activities away from the public eye. Thus, it's harder for the police to detect. The police have a very real need to then now send out a message to tell people, look, these are the practical limitations of what you're going through. For us to help you, you need to help us. But all of that got derailed when the Prime Minister said what he said that day, because it changed the conversation from what is a practical reality of the situation to, oh my God, did you hear what the Prime Minister said? How he could say that, boy? Blah, 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 blah. Victim blaming, victim blaming, victim blaming. He framed it the wrong way. He used the wrong words, and he directed the attention to himself as opposed to the issue and the needs of the people who are trying to treat with the issue, because he was trying to defend himself. Whereas his responsibilities are not to be the arresting officer in the case. His responsibility is to provide the correct support and environment and framework for the police to do their jobs. He didn't speak about that. His statement says that he understood the issue, but he did not understand how to lead and communicate with the issue. And that's one of my problems with our society, that we don't hold our leaders accountable for things like that, so they continue to happen repeatedly. And a lot of people might think it's semantics and it's a small thing, but I would argue that the communication to the public by anyone in a significant public leadership position is of extreme importance. And if you can't handle it there, why are we going to assume that behind closed doors you will be able to handle all the other technical decisions that need to be made? That goes back to the electorate and what are you willing to accept. And as I said it before and I'll say it again, I will harp on that point probably all the way to the elections and maybe after the elections. And there's a part of me that is afraid that we will never do anything about it. We. I am a member of Trinidad and Tobago. I'm a citizen of this country. So that is the price that I'm willing to pay. I stand with you. I will face the consequences, even if I disagree with the decisions, because I live here, and I want to see it better. I feel far too many people are not willing to face the consequences, but they don't necessarily think through the decisions they make that contribute to said consequences. So they end up blaming everybody else. But you know what? If you want to blame everybody, at the very least you need to be willing to include yourself. Hence I say we, not you. We, the people. of Trinidad and Tobago. Remember your allegiance to this republic. Make today a good day, as my co-host would always say, because it's nice to be nice, even if you don't like the person that you're interacting with, still be nice to them. Stay safe, and we will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
WESN